Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to chapter 4 of our Understanding International Relations lectures. We will have a look today at the first theory that challenged the realist preeminence within the discipline of international relations after World War II, foreign policy analysis. It is a middle range theory, not a grand theory. It focuses on how foreign policy decisions are made and the historical background which triggered the new approach was the Cuban Missile Crisis. What did we see last week, ladies and gentlemen? We saw that realism, and more specifically classical realism, dominated the discipline roughly during the first decades of the Cold War. And we saw that this success was due to two major reasons. First, realism proposed a fairly convincing description and explanation of the then power political confrontation opposing the US to the USSR immediately after the end of World War II. This struggle for power was considered to be more important by the realists than the tentative dialogue, which somehow existed, at least temporarily, between the Soviets and the Americans. The realists were right when emphasizing the regularly outbreaking crisis rather than the peaceful resolutions of these crises. They were somehow right when emphasizing the risks of war rather than the possibilities of peace. They focused on the nuclear arms race rather than on the arms negotiations, the arms talks that permitted to control the arms race and even to disarm a little bit later. There was a second reason why the realists were successful in the discipline. It was because of their political or practical utility. That is to say, they provided to American decision makers a somehow scientific explanation or justification of America's involvement on the world political stage. America had practiced an isolationist foreign policy throughout the first 150 years of its existence. It had explained to the American elites had explained this isolationist tradition to the American public opinion by referring to America's exceptionalism. America was different. Now America was no more different from the European powers. It practiced itself a power political strategy. The realists provided the necessary justification. International politics, by definition, is power politics. So we Americans cannot but maintain our GIs all over the world, establish military bases overseas. We have to contain the Soviet threat, etc., etc. And I drew the conclusion that in social sciences in general, and therefore in international relations, two theories emerge and are successful also because of the surrounding non-scientific context. That is to say, the world political context shapes theories, permits them to emerge, and explains why they are successful. Theories do not float freely. They are embedded in a context. They are shaped by this context. The world political context in international relations as this been, but also the academic context. And it is this context that I would like to have a look at. Now, if we have a look at the realists that were prevailing in the American discipline of international relations after World War II, what do we see? We see that Hans Morgenthau, John Hertz, Henry Kissinger, Arnold Wolfers had been German Jews or Central European Jews that had crossed the Atlantic Ocean when they decided to flee Nazi Germany, because their life was in danger, of course. Morgenthau, for instance, had been a student of Max Weber in Munich before going to Switzerland, then to Spain, and then to the US. Why should we care about these somehow private details of these scholars? Well, these details are important for a reason that I already mentioned last week. The realists concerned, and Morgenthau first and foremost, had witnessed all the crises of the first century, of the first half of the 20th century. World War I, the economic depression, Hitler's arrival to power, the Holocaust, World War II, and the outbreak of the Cold War. So they could not be optimistic, and this contributes to explain their very pessimistic outlook. Classical realism does not believe in progress, in peace. So this is the first reason. Since they had witnessed the appeasement policy that the British had adopted after Hitler's arrival to power, and since they had seen that this appeasement policy had somehow permitted Hitler to attack first Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland, thus triggering the outbreak of World War II, they came to the conclusion we cannot afford to adopt an appeasement policy when dealing with the new threat, that is to say, when dealing with the Soviets. We have to adopt a containment policy because of power politics characterizing as such international politics. So this is the first reason. But there is a second reason why the former European life of these American realists was important. The second reason is the following one. Coming from Europe, all these classical realists had been trained in European-style social sciences. And regarding international relations, this means that they used, when analyzing, when proposing their theories of international relations, they were based on political theory or philosophy, on international law, on diplomatic history. Morgenthau's PhD, a dissertation, for instance, dealt with an international law topic. This is important because in the US, in the 1950s, in American social sciences in general, and therefore in international relations too, occurred during the 50s the so-called behavioral revolution. If we should sum up the substance of the behavioral revolution, it consisted mainly in importing in social sciences and therefore in international relations those methods that are used in natural sciences. These methods, mainly formal methods due to mathematics or quantitative methods as used in statistics, had already been imported in economics. And economics was considered at that time to be the most serious, the most successful, the hardest of the different soft social sciences. So in the domain of international relations, more specifically, behaviorists rejected the classical realists' assumptions. They refused to postulate as a starting point human nature as being evil and therefore explaining why men and therefore nation states try to dominate one another. They rejected Morgenthau's assumption according to which international politics by definition is power politics, because states regularly go to war in order to satisfy the national interest. They refused to postulate that the state is embodied in the rational statesman, and that the statesman is rational because he undertakes cost advantage calculations, because he is able to define the national interest in terms of power. So they rejected the classical realists' claims, and they proposed to do what? Well, to look at the concrete behavior of states and of statesmen. How do states behave? How do statesmen behave when they take a decision, when they undertake an action? How do they behave? And this explains why the revolution, the academic revolution, was called behavioral revolution. That is to say, rather than proposing analysis based on a kind of philosophical, if not even metaphysical prejudgment about human nature, they proposed to concretely look at the empirical reality that they wanted to analyze. So they were skeptical towards grand theories based on philosophical starting points. They were favorable to middle range theories, concretely looking at specific processes. So they asked very concretely, how do states behave? Do they really go to war very regularly? Do all the states, or only some of them, regularly resort to violence? Do they go to war only after the failure of diplomacy, as supposed by classical realists such as Morgenthau? And they also asked the question, how do statesmen behave very concretely? How do they take their decisions? Are they really guided by the national interest? Do they undertake a rational cost advantage calculation or not, etc., etc.? The first question, ladies and gentlemen, how do states behave, is at the origin of notably the Correlates of War project. The Correlates of War project was launched in the 1960s by David Singer and Melvin Small, two American scholars at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. This project was directly linked to the then invention of the computer. The computer permits to undertake calculations. Given the huge calculation capabilities, statistical data can be used, quantitative methods can be applied. Without the computer, there would have been probably no behavior revolution. So this project, which still exists, you can have a look at their findings on their website. They were interested in looking concretely at how wars occurred, much more how they occurred rather than why they regularly broke out. How many wars occurred in this or that period of time? Where did they occur? Are there some geographical regions where wars are more likely to break out than in other geographical regions? Which states launched wars? Did the initiators of wars win the wars that they were the first to wage? How many states were involved in the different wars? How many people were killed, etc., etc.? Were there more wars in the past than nowadays, or vice versa? Correlates of War, the project introduced empirical quantitative research in the domain of international relations. And the second question, how do statesmen behave when they take decisions, is precisely at the origin of the so-called foreign policy analysis. Foreign policy analysis, ladies and gentlemen, aims at proposing a new approach of decision-making in foreign policy. It rejects Morgenthau's classical realist approach of the rational statesman embodying, personifying the unitary, the nation state, and it replaces it by two approaches. These two approaches are different from one another, but somehow they are complementary. At least they are complementary since they both emphasize, prove to some extent, the limits of the classical realist's rational actor model. Graham Allison proposed a sociological approach, sociological analysis of foreign policy decision-making. And Robert Jervis both at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, proposed a psychological analysis of foreign policy, a decision-making. So let's start with Graham Allison's sociological approach. And Graham Allison's model, or models, we'll come back to them, were inspired by a very concrete political event, international political event, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. We therefore have a look at this Cuban Missile Crisis before looking at Allison's theoretical analysis of the crisis. So we saw last week, ladies and gentlemen, that after World War II, the world was divided into two camps or two blocks, the Western and the Eastern, or the liberal and the communist camp. This division concerned first and foremost Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. Africa, that was still divided among the two major colonial empires of France and Great Britain, at least up to the very beginning of the 60s, and Latin America from Mexico to Argentina was America's backyard. It was dominated by the USA since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, all the more so since the Roosevelt's corollary of the very end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So, for instance, this meant very concretely that when there was a kind of risk of instability, domestic instability in Latin American states, the US intervened militarily to reestablish what it considered to be its order. So in 1954, for instance, in Guatemala, the newly elected leader, Colonel Arbenz, adopted a nationalization policy of including American-owned firms, multinational firms, notably United Fruit, an American firm that grew bananas in Guatemala. And so what did the Americans do? They sent American soldiers to topple the government of Colonel Arbenz. And they did so on the basis of the Treaty of Rio, the Inter-American Treaty that had been signed in 1947, the somehow American equivalent, the Western Hemisphere equivalent of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with Europe, to contain communism. So economic motivations had justified America's intervention in Guatemala in 1954. And economic reasons were also at the origin of the Cuban crisis. And we would start with the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was dominated somehow directly by the US since 1898, when America had liberated Cuba from Spain. And in the 1950s, Cuba was governed by Fulgencio Batista, who was both a corrupt and a very repressive dictator. He had turned Havana, the capital of Cuba, into a kind of Caribbean Las Vegas, where rich Americans were looking for drugs, sex, and easy money in the casinos, in the nightclubs, and in the strip bars of Havana. America, the US, protected Fulgencio Batista's regime because it fought against communism. And the American justification of America supporting right-wing corrupt dictators in Latin America had been summed up by Roosevelt in the famous phrase that you may know. When talking of Batista, but also of Somoza in Nicaragua, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's a son of a bitch, so we need to protect his regime. The problem, however, is that in Cuba emerged gradually in the 1950s a somehow nationalist guerrilla headed by Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl Castro and the very famous Comandante Che Guevara. And Castro and Guevara managed to get rid of Fulgencio Batista, to overthrow his regime on January the 1st, 1959. And they established a revolutionary government in Havana. The first measures taken by Castro's government were economic measures, the nationalization of American multinational firms. So what did the American government do? It decided trade restrictions. That is to say, the US no longer purchased Cuban sugar, which was the most important export product of Cuba. The US no longer supplied Cuba with oil. So what did the Cubans do? Well, they asked the Soviets to purchase sugar and to sell oil to Cuba. In 1960, a ship exploded in the harbor of Havana, causing the death of 75 people. And in 1961, the CIA financed and equipped and trained an anti-Castro Cuban refugees who landed in Cuba in order to try to overthrow Castro's regime. This was the famous Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a disaster for the US, or for the CIA, and for the anti-Castro Cuban refugees who had come from Florida, because they were defeated. And this contributed to consolidate the Cuban revolutionary regime of Castro. What did Castro do, given the threat of America invading Cuba? They asked, of course, the USSR to protect the Cuban Revolution, and the Americans went further than merely sanctioning economically Cuba. They put an end to whatever kind of diplomatic relation with Cuba. And so gradually, Cuba became an ally, and should I say, a satellite of the USSR. The USSR also profited from this new ally to buy cigars for the members of the Soviet nomenclatura of the Soviet Communist Party, of course. The USSR became Cuba's big brother, and to some extent, the US in Cuba committed the same mistake that they had committed in Egypt during the 1950s. In Egypt, the nationalist Colonel Nasser, who had come to power at the beginning of the 1950s, also had nationalized the Suez Canal Company in order to finance the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. And the British, the French, and the Americans, by their policy, had ended up driving Nasser's into Moscow's arms. Anyway, Cuba became a member of the Soviet bloc. It became a communist country at the latest, at the end of 1961, beginning of 1962. And this was, of course, a huge success for the Soviets. It was a huge success for the Soviets because they now had an ally or satellite in the Latin American backyard of the United States of America. And for the USSR, this offered them an opportunity to reestablish a kind of balance, a geographical balance with the US. The US had its troops and its missiles, its aircraft close to both the Eastern European allies of the USSR. West Germany was the neighbor of Eastern Germany, of Czechoslovakia, etc. And Turkey, on the southern border of the USSR, was an immediate neighbor of the USSR. Turkey was a member of NATO. The Soviet Union, however, had no ally close to the American border in the Western Hemisphere. Now, thanks to the Cuban Revolution and thanks to Cuba becoming communist, the USSR also had an ally very close to America's borders. Florida is a little bit more than 100 miles away from Cuba. Thus started the US-Cuban conflicts, and more specifically, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, opposing the US to the USSR, and more specifically K and K, that is to say, John F. Kennedy, the American president, to Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, the leader of the Soviet, the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party. The crisis started on October 14, 1962, when American U-2 spying planes took pictures of the missile ramps of the Soviet missiles that the Soviet had deployed on Cuba. What did the Kennedy administration do? It established a quarantine line around the Cuban island in order to prevent Soviet ships from landing new missiles on Cuba. And Kennedy asked Khrushchev to dismantle the already deployed Soviet missiles in Cuba. These Cuban missiles were likely to hit the American territory from Washington, New York to Seattle and Los Angeles on the Pacific coast. This crisis, ladies and gentlemen, which was considered as the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War, the one that came closest to nuclear war opposing the US to the USSR, this crisis came to a peaceful end 14 days later, on October 28. The USSR indeed accepted to withdraw its missiles. The US promised to no more try to invade Cuba, and the US also accepted to dismantle its Jupiter missiles deployed in Turkey. I can add that these missiles were technologically obsolete. So the Americans actually lost nothing when deciding to withdraw them. They secretly accepted to do so. The peaceful end of this crisis permitted both superpowers to establish, or inside it, should I say, both superpowers to establish the hotline between Moscow and Washington, between the Pentagon or the White House and the Kremlin, in order to establish a direct communication. The aim was to prevent any risk of unwanted escalation of a crisis to a nuclear war between the two. But this crisis, ladies and gentlemen, which then was won by the Americans, is the immediate historical event at the origin of Graham Allison's analysis, foreign policy analysis, and I thus come back to theory. Graham Allison analyzed this crisis first in a series of academic articles published in academic journals, and then in a book, Essence of Decision, published in 1971, the first edition. The second edition was published at the very end of the 1990s. Graham Allison was joined by Philip Zelikow, an historian, because of historical archives, at least American archives, were opened. That is to say, theorists or scholars had access to American archives, and thus Allison could check whether his analysis of the 1960s, at the beginning of the 70s, was confirmed by what he found in archives. Allison, in his original analysis of the 1960s, was interested in asking three questions. First of all, why had the USSR decided, or Khrushchev, why had he decided to deploy offensive missiles on Cuba? Second question, why did America's reaction consist in establishing a quarantine line around the Cuban island? I feel free to emphasize quarantine, not blockade, though this term is pretty often used. A blockade is an act of war. In peacetime, a blockade is an act of war, and the Americans did not run this risk. They established, strictly speaking, or legally speaking, a quarantine line. And the third question asked by Allison is the following one, or the following one. Why did the USSR accept to withdraw its missiles at the end of the crisis? Allison had been a student of Morgenthau. So spontaneously, of course, he applied what he had learned as a student to provide tentative answers to these three questions. And Morgenthau, when describing how a statesman took decision, had proposed the model of the rational actor, the model. So Allison, to some extent, began his research by doing what Morgenthau had told him. This is what Morgenthau had said: to give meaning to foreign policy, we, researchers, put ourselves in the mind, in the position of statesman who has to take a decision, who is confronted to a crisis and who has to take a decision, and who is likely to choose among alternative solutions. I go on quoting Morgenthau: we, researchers, trying to understand why a statesman undertook this or that action and took this or that decision, we look over his shoulders when he writes his dispatches. We listen to his conversations with other statesmen. We read and anticipate his very thoughts. We do like he did. We think as he does. This is then what Allison will do at the beginning of his research. He will put into practice the so-called rational actor model, according to which decisions are calculations. That is to say, a rational statesman, what do? Well, they try to satisfy some objectives. These objectives are ranked. I would like first to obtain this, and then that, and then a third possibility, etc., etc. And the ranking, of course, is related to the national interest. The national interest is better served by this solution rather, by this objective rather than by this one, etc., etc. Once a statesman has established the different objectives that he is eager to pursue, he chooses among different solutions, among different actions that he may undertake on the basis of the information that he possesses. He then looks at the possible consequences if this or that solution is chosen. And he logically will end up choosing the action which will at least minimize the disadvantages and, if possible, maximize the advantages. And once this action was undertaken, he will evaluate the action concerned, maintaining the same policy if it was successful, or adopt a new one if the action did not permit to obtain satisfaction. So Allison applies then this model to K&K, to Kennedy and to Khrushchev's decision. And he then comes to the following responses to the three questions that he asked. Why did the USSR, Khrushchev, deploy offensive missiles on the Cuban territory? The rational actor model's response is the following one: in order to establish a nuclear balance with the US. Indeed, at the very beginning of the 60s, the USSR was inferior to the US in the domain of nuclear weapons. The USSR, the territory, the Soviet territory, could be hit both by medium-range missiles that the Americans had deployed in Turkey and by intercontinental missiles that the US could launch either from its missile ramps in the US or from submarines in the different oceans. The USSR, however, could not hit the American territory. It had no allies close to the American border until Cuba became communist. And the Soviet technology at that time had not been able to build intercontinental missiles likely to be sent from the USSR against the American territory. So the Cuban communist revolution was a window of opportunity for the USSR. It permitted the USSR to re-establish an equality, a parity, a balance, a nuclear balance with the US. And Allison considers this response to be rational. He also rejects a possible alternative explanation. The USSR deployed missiles to protect the Cuban Revolution, given the Bay of Pigs invasion 1 year earlier. This possible explanation is rejected by Allison. Why? Because, rationally speaking, if the objective of Khrushchev had consisted in protecting the Cuban Revolution, defensive missiles would have been sufficient. Now, the Soviets had deployed offensive missiles. Offensive missiles do not permit to protect. Their objective is to attack, not to defend. Regarding the second question, why did America decide to establish a quarantine line around the Cuban islands? The rational response is the following one. Well, Kennedy's decision was due to his desire to avoid any escalation of the crisis. That is to say, since to establish a quarantine line was a defensive move, America had the advantage of forcing the USSR to take the responsibility of an escalation of crisis by trying to go through the quarantine line. And according to Allison, this decision was also rational when compared to the other possibilities that the Americans have. The Americans could have chosen to bomb, to destroy the missiles, or they could have chosen to send American soldiers in order for these troops to land in Cuba in order to fight against the Soviets. But rationally speaking, these two solutions were very risky. In the case of bombing to destroy the missiles, the Soviet soldiers had run the risk of being killed. And if the Americans had sent troops, their soldiers might have been killed by the Soviet soldiers present or by the Cuban defenders. This was very risky. And there was another risk. If the Americans landed on Cuba or bombed Cuba, the Soviets could have retaliated against West Berlin, which at that time was within the Eastern German territory. So it was rational, according to Allison, for Kennedy to opt for the quarantine line, a defensive move, a moderate behavior. And last but not least, regarding the third question, why did the USSR accept to withdraw the missiles after 2 weeks of crisis? Well, the reason is the following one. Khrushchev knew that the USSR was inferior to the US. That is to say, in the case of a war, the USSR had almost no possibility to defeat the Americans. So it would have been irrational to run the risk of a confrontation with the Americans. It was rational to accept this kind of defeat by withdrawing the missiles. The diplomatic defeat was a lesser evil than the prospective military defeat in the case of a nuclear exchange with the Americans. So at first sight, ladies and gentlemen, Allison came to the conclusion, yes, the rational actor model, according to which decisions are rational calculations, cost advantage calculations, this rational actor model is, at first sight, pretty convincing. But Allison, of course, was eager to criticize this model, to show the limits of the model. And he does looked for some elements which contradicted the relevance, which undermined the relevance of this model. And he found such an element. And the element concerned was the following one. Throughout the crisis, throughout the summer, preceding the crisis of October, that is to say, in July and August, the Soviets had told the Americans, we did not deploy missiles on Cuba. We do not plan to do so. To put it differently, the Soviets did not want the Americans to know that they had deployed missiles on Cuba. However, and here's then is the problem, however, American spying planes had been able to take pictures of these missiles, which means that the missiles had not been concealed, they had not been hidden by the Soviets. So on the one hand, the Soviets claimed we did not and we do not want to deploy missiles, but on the other hand, they did nothing to hide the missiles, thus permitting the Americans to take pictures. This is contradictory. This is somehow irrational. The Soviets should have hidden the missiles, or they should have deployed surface-to-air missiles in order to down the U-2 spying planes before they could take pictures. How then can we account for this kind of irrationality? It is precisely in order to explain this kind of contradictory element that Allison proposed two alternative models to the rational actor model of the realists. And these two alternative models are, first, the organizational process model, and second, the governmental or bureaucratic politics model. Let's start with the organizational process model. The empirical starting point of this model is the following one. According to Allison, the Soviet Union's oblivion or neglect to hide the missiles that the Red Army deployed on Cuba was not an irrational mistake. It was due to the fact that the USSR acted as usual. Concretely, when the Red Army deployed its missiles on the Soviet territory, or even in the territory of its Eastern and Central European allies, it did not need to hide them by definition, because the missiles were deployed either within the USSR or in the Soviet camp or the Soviet bloc. So when then the Red Army deployed its missiles in Cuba, it acted as it was used to act. It adopted the same routine standard of behavior, the standard pattern of behavior. Organizational routines explain foreign policy actions. And Allison, when undertaking his research, had interviews with American policymakers who had been in the Kennedy administration during the crisis. And he was told by McNamara, the Secretary of Defense in Kennedy's administration, that the Americans had learned after the end of the crisis that the Soviet soldiers that arrived in Cuba had arrived in Cuba with skis in their luggage. Skis in their luggage, for the very simple reason that the Red Army, when making its maneuvers in the USSR, of course, must take into consideration the huge quantities of snow in the Russian winter. And McNamara told Allison, well, we were lucky. It was a luck that we did not know that, because if we had known that the Soviets had arrived on Cuba with skis in their luggage, we would have come to the conclusion, well, they planned to invade the Rocky Mountains, where there is a lot of snow too during the months of the winter. So governments or administrations act according to their standard patterns of behavior much more than they do undertake rational cost advantage calculations. And Allison then generalizes this model by saying that the actor which takes a decision or undertakes an action is not a unitary, monolithic nation or government. It is rather a constellation, a set of organizations on top of which the government leaders sit. And these leaders, the American president or the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Army, are dependent when taking decisions or when undertaking actions. They are dependent on the various agencies that compose their administration. So Morgenthau, when claiming that foreign policy decisions are rational cost advantage calculations, is wrong. Why? Because an action undertaking today is more or less similar to an action that was undertaken at the point in time t-1, and it will be followed by actions in the future that are almost similar in a point of time t+1 as they are today. To sum up this first model, this organizational process models, decisions are automatic outputs of standard patterns of behavior. Once Allison proposed this first alternative model, or the second of his three models, he added a third one, a second alternative one, the so-called governmental or bureaucratic politics model. Why? Because after coming to the conclusion that the Red Army had deployed its missile as usual in Cuba, he asked a new question. Well, the Red Army is not the only agency within the Soviet administration. There is also the State Department, the KGB, the Communist Party, etc., etc. Why then was it the Red Army that deployed the missiles in Cuba on the basis of its routine standard of behavior? Well, Allison proposes the bureaucratic politics model, consisting in saying that within an administration, within the Soviet administration, the Red Army managed to impose, succeeded in imposing its view upon the different other agencies, thus being able to influence, to shape, to somehow determine Khrushchev's final decision. Khrushchev accepted the point of view of the Red Army within the kind of bureaucratic struggle that opposed the Red Army to the KGB, to the State Department, and to the other agencies of the Soviet Union's administration. And this concrete answer is once again generalized by Allison in his third model, the bureaucratic politics model. According to this model, a national administration is composed by various elements, both individual members. John F. Kennedy had many advisors who told him what to do and what not to do during the crisis, the so-called executive committee. The same is true for the Soviet administration. individual members and collective agencies. In the US, the Defense Department or Pentagon, the State Department, the National Security Council, the CIA, etc., etc. All these agencies and all these individual members have their own interests that they would like to promote, their bureaucratic interests. These interests are not always similar to the interests of the other members of the administration. If you look at the US Army, it was in the interest of the US Air Force to bomb. It was the interest of the US Army to land, to send the soldiers, to invade the Cuban territory. It was in the interest of the US Navy to establish the quarantine line. So it was, in the case of the US administration, the US Navy that managed to convince Kennedy that the best policy consisted in establishing a quarantine line. So the struggle among bureaucratic agencies within the Kennedy administration was won by the US Navy, with the different individual members in the executive committee who were favorable to this decision and who therefore ended up convincing Kennedy, who abandoned the other alternative solutions. So the other solutions were not rejected after a kind of rational cost advantage, or not merely on the basis of a rational cost advantage calculation. They were also rejected because of the capacity of the US Navy to somehow impose its will to the detriment of the alternative solutions. So to sum up this bureaucratic model, ladies and gentlemen, decisions are final outcomes of the struggle among different members, individual or collective members of an administration. These members all are eager to shape the final decision, the president's final decision, and some of them manage to do so and others fail to do so. And we can add another example, which was not studied by Graham Allison because it occurred more recently. In 2003, George W. Bush decided to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein. This war fought by George Bush was favored by some members within his administration, and it was opposed by other members. More concretely, within the Bush administration, there were three groups of politicians representing three different visions of what America should do. There were first the so-called realists, or pragmatic realists, notably Colin Powell, the then Secretary of State, and Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor of Bush. They were not necessarily favorable to a war, but if they accepted a war, it was only a war authorized explicitly by the UN Security Council. First group. The second group was made by the nationalist hawks, the hardliners, notably Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, and Dick Cheney, George W. Bush's vice president. And then there was a third group, the so-called neoconservatives, headed by Paul Wolfowitz, number 2 of the Pentagon, and Richard Pearl, an advisor of Bush, the head of the Defense Policy Board of the Pentagon. So three groups. And the two groups of the hardliners and the neoconservatives had one common point, despite their different visions. They did not want to submit to a UN Security Council resolution. So they wanted to get rid of Colin Powell and of Condoleezza Rice. So they kind of established an alliance in order to constitute the majority within the George Bush administration. And thus, they convinced George Bush to go to war, despite the minority of members such as Powell and Condoleezza Rice skeptical towards the planned war against Saddam Hussein in 2003. So to sum up, ladies and gentlemen, Allison's contribution to international relations theory, and more specifically to the analysis of foreign policy decision-making, Allison's alternative models, the governmental bureaucratic model and the organizational process model, have had a lasting impact upon the field of foreign policy analysis in international relations. Almost nobody nowadays accepts the classical realist model of the rational statesman, which is also the common sense model. We always, almost systematically, automatically believe that Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Macron or Johnston are rational statesmen when undertaking this or that decision. The picture, the scientific picture in the discipline of international relations nowadays consists in saying that the leader, be it the prime minister, the president, the chancellor, the secretary general, etc., is constrained by organizational routines. He is influenced by a bunch of counselors and advisors guided by their own personal or bureaucratic interests. So there is no more unitary state, there is no more rational statesman, or at least there is no more perfectly absolute rational statesman. There is no more somehow objective national interests ever since Graham Allison's contribution. And the classical realist model is all the more so put into question because of the second approach, the second model in foreign policy analysis due to the behavioral revolution, Robert Jervis's psychological approach to foreign policy analysis, put forward notably in his landmark book, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, published in 1976. Robert Jervis also published more recently in 2017, a book which is a collection of his different articles entitled How Statesmen Think. In the subtitle, you also find the term psychology, the psychology of international politics. So in his first book, Jervis starts with, once again, the classical realist model of foreign policy decision-making, not Morgenthau, but Wolfers. Wolfers, who in his 1962 essays called Discord and Collaboration, had proposed a metaphor in order to describe and to account for foreign policy decisions. The metaphor of a house on fire. According to Wolfers, when a house is burning, what do people living in the house do? Well, they try to get out of the house in order to save their life. They run towards the exits. And Wolfers emphasized whatever their psychological dispositions, whatever their psychological specificities. And he then applied this metaphor to international politics. When a state or a statesman is confronted to an imminent danger similar to a house burning for someone living in the house, what will the statesman do? Well, he will increase automatically his own military resources in order to be able to cope with this imminent threat emanating from another power, from a neighboring power, etc., etc. So the statesman, whatever his psychological characteristics, will adopt one of the single policy of increasing the military resources in order to permit the state to cope with this objective outside danger. According to Jervis, things are more complicated. And he takes the example of what happened during the 1930s. When Hitler came to power, Europe was about to burn. or at least in 1939, when World War II broke out, this World War II proved that Hitler had planned to invade all the neighbors of Germany in order to exert Nazi Germany's domination over Europe and then over the world. So there was indeed a kind of a threat, but this threat had not been perceived as such by, he takes the examples of the British statesman. And this is what he wrote, permitting us to establish the difference with Arnold Wolfers. Despite, he refers to Wolfers, despite the implication of Wolfers' proposition that we know what to do when we are faced by an extreme danger, such as a house on fire, the question is often contested, what to do. For Churchill, and he then comes to Hitler's arrival to power. For Churchill, the house was burning soon after Hitler came to power. For Chamberlain, the then British Prime Minister, the house burned only after the agreements of Munich 1938. And for other British politicians, the house was never on fire because they somehow had some sympathies for Nazi Germany. So, not everybody, not every statesman, though supposed being rational, perceives the reality in the same way, and the same is true nowadays, of course. We all know that climate change is what expects us, but the different politicians and we ourselves do not perceive it the same way. Is it due to human actions or not? Look at the pandemics. It is not perceived by different people in the same way. Dangerous for some, not that dangerous for others. Despite the people concerned, at first point, being rational to some extent. So how then can we explain this lack of rationality or this limited rationality? So according to Jervis, the question that should be asked, we come back to his example, how can we explain that the smart and supposedly rational Chamberlain and Hitler did not have the same analysis of the consequences of Hitler's arrival to power? Well, the answer is the following one: because Chamberlain and Churchill and all the British statesmen and the statesmen in general act or perceive the reality just as we, you and me, average people, do perceive reality. We do not perceive reality as it objectively is, but we perceive it subjectively as we believe it is, and pretty often as we would like it to be. On the basis of what? On the basis of our pre-established beliefs, on the basis of our pre-established convictions. To put it differently, the rationality of a statesman is limited by what Jervis calls misperceptions. Misperceptions are wrong, inadequate, subjective perceptions of what the objective reality really consists in. And they are due not necessarily to a lack of rationality, but to cognitive or psychological processes. That is to say, the reality, ladies and gentlemen, we are coping with, even in our everyday life, is somehow complex. So we are happy when we understand the reality we are living in. That is to say, we are looking for psychological comfort, for cognitive consonance, and we are upset by psychological dissonance or cognitive discomfort. When then we are faced with a reality which disturbs us because it is different from what we believe, from what we have internalized as conviction, what do? We neglect this disturbing reality, or we reinterpret it in order to re-establish a kind of psychological comfort. That is to say, we do not see the reality as it really is, objectively, but more as we would like it to be. At least we ignore those informations that will confirm the psychological dissonance. We will try to re-establish our psychological comfort by remaining satisfied with the first interpretation of reality, which corroborates our pre-established feelings. Of course, this is true for average people like you and me, but also for statesmen. The misperceptions vary from one person to another one. Misperceptions and cognitive biases, more general, depend on the personality of the statesman. They depend on experiences they had as children or teenagers. They depend on the impact political events had on their personal life and on their career. The intensity of these cognitive biases are likely to be different from one statesman to another. But what is beyond doubt, according to Jervis, is the fact that they change they impact the supposed rationality of the statesman taking a decision. And this, true in general, is all the more so true when it comes to crisis, likely to favor the outbreak of war. When a statesman is confronted to a situation which may contribute to a war, such wars are favored, according to Jervis, because of misperceptions consisting in what? Consisting in wrong judgments of the enemy's intentions, consisting in inaccurate perceptions of an enemy's capacities, not merely intentions, but capacities, and also consisting in wrong judgments of the behavior of third-party states. I will give you very concrete examples, either proposed by Jervis himself or more recent ones. In 1905, Russia went to war against Japan. This war, the decision of the then Russian Tsar, was favored by the Russian complex of superiority. The Russians were a white people, the Japanese were non-white people. The then existing, somehow racist vision consisted in saying that white men were superior to non-white men, which amounts to saying that the Russians underestimated Japan. They underestimated Japan's military strength. So they decided to go to war. They were defeated by the Japanese. All the more so, the Japanese had gone through the Meiji Revolution, which permitted them to become, in a very short time, a very powerful industrialized nation, and therefore also to dispose of a very powerful navy, which crushed the Russians. Underestimation of the strength of the Japanese. So it is an example of the second misperception, inaccurate judgment of an enemy's capacities. World War II broke out because Hitler, after remilitarizing the Rhine River, the left bank of the Rhine River, after attacking Austria, Czechoslovakia, ended up attacking Poland. According to Jervis, it is one explanation possible. It is not the only or the best. It is one explanation possible within the foreign policy decision analysis proposed by Jervis. Okay, so according to Jervis, this expansionist behavior of Hitler was favored indirectly by Great Britain's appeasement policy. Great Britain's appeasement policy was due to Chamberlain believing that Hitler merely wanted to reunite the German nation in the German state. So he underestimated the objective goals of Hitler, which consisted in dominating the rest of the world, and therefore in also attacking, he had also to attack non-German nations such as Poland. The Korean War in 1950 Kim Il-sung, the then North Korean dictator, the grandfather of today's autocrat, attacked South Korea. He committed the following mistake or misperception. He had listened to Dean Acheson's, the then American Secretary of State's speech, where Dean Acheson had defined the defensive perimeter of the US. And this defensive perimeter included Japan and Taiwan, but not South Korea. So Kim Il-sung and Stalin and Mao came to the conclusion, well, the Americans will not defend South Korea if we attack it in order to reunify the Korean peninsula. They were wrong. They misperceived America's policy. America at that time was a third party state. It's an example of the third type of misperception. Anti-Americans intervened in order to push the North Koreans back to North Korea. The war of 1982 opposing Argentina to the British, Malvinas war, according to the Argentinians, the Falklands War, according to the British, the Argentinians invaded the Malvinas Islands or the Falklands Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean. They believed that the British would not react. What did Margaret Thatcher do? It sent not merely British military ships, but even civil ships in order to permit to reconquer the islands that the Argentinian junta, the Argentinian military dictatorship, believed that it could conquer very easily. The Gulf War 1991, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990. It invaded and annexed Kuwait because it believed it would be easy for it to do so. This was absolutely correct. Kuwait was unable to defend itself, a small, tiny state confronted to Iraq. But Saddam Hussein committed the mistake first of thinking that the US of George Bush, the father, would not intervene. And it committed the mistake because it believed that the Soviet Union would, as an ally of Iraq, deter the US from intervening. The Soviet Union, however, itself in 1990, 1991 was confronted to its own domestic problems. More and more Soviet republics proclaimed their independence, and the then Soviet leader Gorbachev did not help Saddam Hussein. So the Americans intervened and Saddam Hussein was defeated. And last example, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2003, Saddam Hussein was perceived by George W. Bush, the administration of George W. Bush, as very hostile, as having aggressive intentions, given also Saddam Hussein's aggressions of Iran in 1980 and of Kuwait, I mentioned this 1 minute ago, in 1990. So this is an example of the first kind of misperceptions. The Bush administration, within this explanation, which is therefore different from Allison's analysis, which I put forward some 10 to 15 minutes ago, within Robert Jervis's model, George Bush overestimated the aggressive intentions, the hostile intentions of Saddam Hussein, which led then George Bush to attack and to get rid of Saddam Hussein during Operation Iraqi Freedom. So to sum up, ladies and gentlemen, this second approach within a foreign policy analysis, beyond sociological constraints, psychological biases, cognitive biases also contribute to limit a statesman's postulated rationality. To conclude this chapter then, ladies and gentlemen, we can say that the foreign policy analysis proposed by first Allison and a bit later by Jervis, foreign policy analysis was the first domain in the history of international relations as a discipline, and to call into question, to put into question the preeminence of realism in the specific domain of foreign policy. The postulated rationality of the perfect rationality of the statesman is no longer accepted nowadays. The objectively existing national interest is no longer accepted nowadays. So realism was challenged by a middle range theory, and in the 70s, realism will be challenged by an alternative grand theory, this time due to the rise of the third world, which was neglected by realism. And this new challenge will be the neo-Marxist theory, which we will have a look at next week, of course. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to today's class. I wish you a great day and hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.